Good afternoon. Welcome to Intelligent Talk with Ralph McElvenney. Join us every Thursday at 5 p.m. on the City World Radio Network as we discuss topics in politics, art, and current events.
Okay, welcome to Intelligent Talk. The website is intelligenttalk.com. We're very pleased to have Mr. Nick Jelicoe on. He's the author of Jutland, The Unfinished Battle. Most of us don't know much about the Battle of Jutland, but it was an important naval engagement fought May 31st to June 1st, 1916, by British and German naval forces off the coast of Denmark. Had Britain lost that battle, it could very well have meant losing the war. Mr. Jelicoe's grandfather was Admiral John Jelicoe, the commander of the British fleet. So, Mr. Jelicoe, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Could you please just discuss the British strategy in regards to Germany and the naval blockade and what that meant?
Yes, I think the naval blockade was really a key element in waging economic warfare on Germany. Clearly, traditionally, the Navy had been used in close blockade on enemy coasts to hold ships off the enemy coast, and that had been used since Napoleonic times. What made this period different was that the new weapons of mines and submarines made this sort of strategy extremely risky, playing this kind of game so close to an enemy coast. So a distant blockade was made use of, and by that I mean that the North Sea was bottled up. The Grand Fleet protecting the work of the 10th Cruiser Squadron way up to the north, blocking the gap between the Shetlands and Norway. And then in the south, Britain used barrages armed with mines to really block off the channel at Dover. It's clear that sometimes this naval policy was at odds with Britain's foreign policy. Clearly, a tactic like this, which involved interdicting ships on the high sea to make sure that they weren't carrying contraband to Germany, would infuriate, as it did, neutral powers. It's quite interesting that the Chief of Naval Operations, William Benson, later on told William Sims, when he came over to head up American naval forces in Europe, don't let the British pull the wool over your eyes. We'd just as soon fight them. It was a close-run thing, and in fact, in the end, Germany infuriated America more. After Jutland, Scheer saw that he might be able to use the same strategy that the British were using on him and on Germany. He didn't feel that he could win an outright naval confrontation, but what he could do, he felt, was to bring Britain to its knees by interdicting her trade. And Britain, frankly, was far more dependent on overseas trade than Germany. Germany was a land power. Britain, an island nation, was a sea power. Anything that we needed that couldn't be produced locally had to come across the seas. So this is why, we put in a naval blockade really to instigate and to further a slow strangulation of the German war economy.
All right, so the blockade was put to basically, as you said, slowly starve Germany, try to get them to capitulate. Ironically, Germany had some success in the East initially in their battles, and more successful than they certainly had in the West. But England was trying to strangle Germany. You had the British fleet based up north, the northern United Kingdom. It was Scapa Flow, correct? Was it British?
Yes, Scapa Flow is the traditional British naval base on the Orkney Islands, just northeast of the Scottish mainland.
Okay, so just if we discuss now the Battle of Jutland, could you just first tell me what the general orders were that were given to your grandfather? Because the importance of the fleet was needed to blockade Germany. So obviously the British did not want to lose that fleet. What were the general orders given to Admiral Jelicoe?
I have not actually seen written general orders, but it was clear that the annihilation of the German fleet was actually low down in terms of the order of priorities that that my grandfather was operating under. I mean, at the beginning of the war, the most important thing actually was to protect the supply routes to the British Expeditionary Force fighting in France. That was actually fundamental. It was felt this was going to be a land war, and the Navy's role was an economic role. The secondary role was to sort of hamper German trade, and then lastly, but the least likely objective was actually to prevent a German invasion. The general orders, though, that my grandfather was working under was really to try and make sure that the Germans would be lured out of their harbours at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, and that slowly Britain could actually get rid of this quite irritating menace, a fleet in being, which was using up a tremendous amount of resources. It's quite ironic, though, that Admiral Scheer was thinking of a sortie at exactly the same time. So both fleets were going out to actually see if they could tempt out smaller elements of the other's fleet and overwhelm them.
Now, the British fleet was substantially bigger than the German fleet, correct?
It was substantially bigger, not as large in terms of the ratio of dominance that my grandfather would have liked, but in key elements like the battleships, the dreadnought. At Jutland, the British fielded 28 dreadnoughts, the Germans 16. What's maybe more important is that within these numbers is the type of dreadnought being fielded. The British actually were able to put on the sea that day 4 of the most powerfully gunned dreadnoughts, the new Queen Elizabeth class, that the Germans could not rival. These machines were the technological edge, absolutely at the what's the expression, at the very edge of technological advance. They were the latest and greatest. But in that sense, I might just do an aside here. There's a lesson to be learned that, if you put too many eggs into one technology basket, sometimes you're risk averse. And indeed, that was one of maybe the lessons of Jutland, coming out of Jutland.
So let me
excuse me. No, aside from the battleships, I mean, both fleets came to the battle with a battle cruiser fleet. The British around about 9, the Germans 5. They were fairly equal in terms of destroyers, 78 versus 60. And in light cruisers, the British also had an advantage, somewhere around 3-1.
So let me just, if I could, summarize the German strategy, and you can tell me if I'm correct. Basically, Scheer and Hipper wanted to get part of the British fleet out first because they didn't want to take on the combined might of the British. So their goal was basically to goad the British into deploying some forces out first without the main fleet. They were shelling the coast of eastern England. They were doing raiding, etc. And in fact, the British do deploy Admiral Beatty, who was basically your grandfather's deputy. He comes out with part of the fleet, and he engages the Germans. What were the results of that first battle, please? That first engagement?
You're talking about Dogger Bank?
Yes, the first engagement between Beatty and the Germans.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, actually. I mean, until Jutland, there wasn't a battle fleet engagement. Dogger Bank was a disappointment in the sense that, yes, the Blücher was sunk. It was a very large battleship that the Germans lost. But the chance to actually inflict much, much higher damage was lost. Things went wrong in signaling. It was the British had a pretty advanced capability of signals decryption. And we're aware that there was going to be an attack, and we're waiting for this to happen. So that it was even more disappointing when the trap that was laid could not be sprung properly.
Yes, so the initial engagement, you said, is disappointing. I want to go back to the main fleet of Admiral Jelicoe. Could you first tell me what Room 40 was, please, the British?
Yes, I mean, Room 40 was, in fact, the physical room in the Admiralty into which signals came and were decrypted. It was largely a decryption function rather than an intelligence or an analysis function. And I think that was, again, something that changes quite radically after Jutland.
Okay, so Room 40 is doing the best they can to give the intelligence, or as you said, the encryption and give the information to the British. The main fleet now leaves under your grandfather, and there is an engagement with German naval forces. Your grandfather skillfully puts them in, as you said, a T position twice. And could you describe what a T position is, please, and how that worked?
Yes, a T position is really when you cross over an advancing line of ships coming towards you, and you are able to bring to bear many more guns because you're firing from a wider arc on the top of the T, whereas the opponent finds most of his guns actually blocked by the ship in front. So it's a desirable position to be in. But I think it also gives the impression that these battles are tremendously set piece. And in fact, there was a fair amount of chaos on the day too.
Right. So I believe your grandfather gets the Germans in a T position twice, as they say, and the Germans do a good job too. When they see the superior British fleet, they do a good job maneuvering away, and then inexplicably they come back at some point and re-engage the British, even though they're heavily outnumbered. I wasn't sure why they did that.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, if one sort of walks through it, when Scheer initially turned away, he executed a maneuver which was called a battle turnaway. And it was a maneuver where involving each ship turning on its own axis as the ship in front has started to execute that turn. So at a fleet under full steam and under battle conditions, it's an extremely gutsy maneuver, and he executed it with brilliance. One moment, my grandmother could see a number of ships out in front, never more than sort of maybe 2 or 3 at maximum because of the conditions on the day. But 3 minutes later, there was nothing to be seen. What Scheer believes is that he might be able to cross over the back of the British fleet as it's advancing from his port, from his left to starboard, to the right. In fact, he makes a mistake and blunders right back into the middle of the British line of battle, which was extended out around about 5 miles. So it's a huge mass of guns piling steel, throwing steel across a 10,000-yard gap.
What would the effect then after the battle? What were the approximate battle losses on both sides? Do you have a rough recollection?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the interesting thing is that in terms of wounded, they're approximately equal. Roughly, I think 600 on the British side, somewhere around about 500 on the German side. Where it really differs, though, is that the British lose close on around 6,000 sailors, and the Germans 2,500, and those deaths sprung from really one source of error, and that is the management of the magazines and protecting those magazines, or having failed to protect those magazines from flash coming down from a strike in one of the turrets. And when a battleship, or when a battle cruiser in this instance, is hit and goes down, if you're lucky enough to survive, you probably die of shock or exposure in the North Sea. But out of crews of roughly 1,100 people, I mean, on the first ship to go down, Indefatigable, 3 people bob up in the water, and one of those dies in the water almost immediately. On Queen Mary, which goes down half an hour into the battle, it's 17 survivors out of a crew of 1,200. On Invincible at 6:30, roughly 7 out of a crew of 1,100. I mean, they are monumental losses, instantaneous death. A shell strikes, 1,000 psi pressure wave goes through a ship, killing everybody that's on a ship. And in fact, one sees some of the photographs, one particular photograph of Indefatigable, which, as I say, was the first battle cruiser to go down. And what we thought for 100 years was a ship still manned with living sailors sinking is in fact a ghost ship that was hit and destroyed 6 minutes earlier with probably not a single person alive on board. These were catastrophic explosions.
The British had too much ammunition, didn't they, on the ships, and just overloaded with ammunition that was easily flammable?
It wasn't so much a question of too much ammunition. It was more a question that the cordite that they used was particularly unstable, and that while there were protective measures on paper in force, under the heat of battle, a lot of the training was thrown to the aside. And the philosophy at the time was the faster you can feed the guns and pour on the shell, the more likely you are to bring down an opponent. I say the philosophy of the time, it wasn't a philosophy with which my grandfather agreed and actually tried very strongly to argue against it. That being the case, gunners brought up and stockpiled as much cordite outside of the protective shells of the outside of the protective steel shells of the magazines, and the smallest spark could kill a ship.
All right, so I just want to summarize this battle. Basically, 1916, off the coast of Denmark, First Admiral Beatty engages. As you said, there's a lot of confusion. There's then your grandfather's main fleet engages. There's some of the Room 40 intelligence, or the decryption of what the intelligence was just simply not correct. Some of the information that he got, there was a lot of confusion on both sides. The British took somewhat higher losses than the Germans, but your grandfather, as you said, skillfully got them in that T position twice and did a lot of damage on the Germans. Now, the German fleet decides to withdraw, and there was some controversy now about why your grandfather didn't pursue the retreating German fleet and try to have like a Battle of Trafalgar type knockout. Could you just explain his thinking on that, please?
No, sure. Well, in the phases of the battle, there's a phase after the battle fleets meet and they start to run south that I call the turnaway. And this is when a torpedo attack, a spoiling torpedo attack, is launched against the British line of dreadnoughts. And its sole intent was actually to drive the British away from the German battle line so that the older pre-dreadnoughts could get back south. My grandfather basically had two choices in front of him, either to turn towards the torpedoes and to try and close the gap, or to run from the torpedoes. Closing towards is extremely dangerous. You imagine a 20,000, 25,000 ton dreadnought, a pretty lumbering object, plowing through the water under very difficult conditions of visibility, trying to spot torpedoes coming towards them at a closing speed of somewhere around 45, 50 knots, and nimbly avoid them. Or you turn away from the torpedoes and actually try to outrun them. The problem here was that having turned away, contact was lost. Contact between the van, the leading elements of the British battle fleet, and the battle cruisers and battle fleet of the German high seas fleet was lost. And so Jelicoe was always accused afterwards, after the war, of really having been too conservative, not having wanted to take risks. Now, he said before the battle actually took place, when he was outlining what he thought the tactics of the day would be, that he would take this action. And he was fully supported by the Admiralty, including Churchill, by people who would later be criticizing him. I think, it's an interesting issue, not just because I look at it in terms of a geometric issue. If he were to turn towards the torpedoes, there was a certain point in turning his battleships that he would have actually presented a target that was not 95 foot in the beam, but would have been 600 foot, a submariner's perfect firing solution. Not only that, the threat was coming from the northwest. The German fleet was heading to the south. If Jelicoe, my grandfather, had turned into the torpedo stream, he would have actually been turning away and losing distance with the German battle fleet at the same time. And that hasn't really been discussed. He was in a situation where it was kind of, you'd be damned both ways. He didn't feel that he should take the risk and lose some of his battleships. Now, it's an interesting point here, because I feel that, while at Jutland, the British Navy was in the lee of Trafalgar and was, sinking and swimming in that tradition, I think the Royal Navy today still has some of the same tendency to be stuck in the lee of Jutland. It's caught in this Nelsonian tradition of you can do no wrong if you close with the enemy. Well, you can. And you need to just think out firing solutions and think out ahead of time, if you have the opportunity, what the costs and the risks are. Frankly, he weighed them up and felt that this was too high a risk to actually turn into the oncoming stream. I think where he can be criticized, however, is for not organizing a much more vigorous use of either the light cruisers, but particularly the destroyers, to actually advance out ahead and to maintain the contact with the enemy. I think in Jutland, a battle fought under the really appalling conditions, as I said, of visibility, not only because of the North Sea fog of the day. This was towards the end of the day. There was floating cordite over the sea. There were chemical smoke screens floating around as well. Not an easy condition at all to fight such a major battle. Nevertheless, I think, there is this issue of the lack of really competent signals and reporting back to the flagship of very, very fast changing battle conditions. I don't think it was a question of him over-controlling. I think that it was necessary that he controlled the line. Otherwise, it could have actually been catastrophic in terms of outcome.
So let me just summarize and see if you agree with me. So basically, it's for people that don't remember the Battle of Trafalgar, 1805. The Admiral Nelson, whose ship you can see to this day in Portsmouth, the HMS Victory, defeats essentially the French and the Spanish fleet. A very important victory. It basically stops any chance of Napoleon going to invade England. And people were hoping, I guess, that Admiral Jelicoe, when they had some initial skirmish with the German forces, he would then pursue them and be like Nelson, like wipe them out. But you're saying that the visibility was poor, the intelligence he had been given was bad. It was near the end of the day. There was a lot of destruction and chaos. The engagement with Beatty had not gone well. And basically, in addition to the torpedoes, there were also mines that the Germans were laying too. And Churchill had also said too that your grandfather was the only person that could lose the war in one afternoon. Didn't he say that?
Yes, he did. I mean, because he was taking almost all the fleet elements to sea in what could be a critical battle. When Nelson was fighting, he took roughly 30% of the capital ships available to him. So if he had lost, it would have actually had a lesser outcome.
Oh, I think that's interesting. I didn't know he only had 30% of the British fleet. That's interesting. I didn't know that.
It's somewhere around that sort of number. But I think that, also if you compare and contrast, I mean, in Nelson's time, the two fleets were approaching each other at a probably, steady 4 to 5 knots under perfect blue sky conditions. Nelson is approaching a battle line which is made up of two linguistically separated forces, a Spanish-speaking force and a French-speaking force. He's also approaching a force that has pretty demoralized and not in great condition. They've had harvest failures on the continent just before. But you must remember that when Nelson fought Trafalgar, he had fought with his so-called band of brothers for 7 or 8 years. He knew them intimately, and he knew his equipment intimately. The speed of technology change was pretty minimal in ship design. If you contrast that to Jutland, the torpedo had a range of probably, 600 to 1,000 yards at 1900. It was now close to 15,000 yards, so it could actually be fired at the extreme range of gunnery. The submarine was a threat that at the beginning of 1914 was scoffed by almost both sides. Things change at a very, very rapid pace. And I think that, what we also fail to see here is that Trafalgar is 1805, the defeat in the Treaty of Vienna is 1815. It wasn't a decisive battle. It was made it was given mythical proportions by the British. And I think that was to the detriment of the British. It built up such expectations that it allowed certainly politicians, but absolutely, certainly the naval officers who were actually to undertake command, incredibly restricted maneuver and completely unrealistic expectations of what could be achieved on one afternoon. This was a philosophy that was put forward by the American naval writer Mahan, that one could have a decisive naval battle. It wasn't to be the case, and I think Jutland absolutely proved that it's going to be a long slog, and the Navy's role was not going to be one of glory and recognition of one extraordinary battle. It was going to be a long, quiet slog that might not get recognized. And indeed, I think 100 years later, it is only just starting to kind of dawn on people just how powerful the Royal Navy's role was during the First World War.
Just as an aside, too, you mentioned in the book, which I hadn't known, that Battle of Trafalgar, while it was a victory, it sort of retarded the British shipbuilding industry and the British naval advances, because they were so full of pride and success of what they had done that they didn't really do a lot of technological advancements. And as a result, the British Navy actually got retarded over the next 100 years from advancements they could otherwise have had. So in some ways you could say it was a Pyrrhic victory, but of course it's gone down as a great victory. And you mentioned the distinction between that and Jutland. When I think about your grandfather, I think about, two things come to mind. Churchill and Air Marshal Dowding, and Air Marshal Dowding had wanted to keep Churchill from keeping the RAF planes to defend France. I mean, Churchill was intent upon sending them over there, and Dowding realized those planes would be needed for the defense of England. So as a result, France fell, but the RAF was able to, of course, defend off the German fighters and preserve the country. So I think Dowding was probably made the correct decision there to husband those forces. Or I think of Admiral Spruance in Midway, who they engaged the Japanese. He then decided not to pursue the Japanese fleet, and it would have led them right into a huge battle group that Yamamoto still had, and maybe we would have lost the U.S. aircraft carrier. So Spruance's decision was, I think, the correct decision, as you could certainly argue that your grandfather's decision was too. It was too risky to risk the entire fleet to pursue something with mines and torpedoes and fog and haziness, and also the faulty info on Rome 40. I mean, at this point, Admiral Jelicoe must not have had too much confidence in many things, given the way Beatty had performed, who would later criticize him, I know, given the Rome 40 intelligence. And Churchill would, of course, criticize him, too, when he had approved, as you said, these orders had all been approved. Do you think all the criticism of your grandfather is essentially just politics? Is that just the way people behave after?
No, I think some of it he could have probably managed better. Managing spin in war, managing the narrative is incredibly important. The Navy, the Admiralty, bungled the reporting of Jutland in an extraordinary fashion. Within a week, I think it had to issue 5 revised appreciations on what had happened. And indeed, at the end of the day, they invited a former journalist, Winston Churchill, to actually try and explain to the British public what had happened. I think that, you've asked a very large question, so I should try and tackle it slowly. I think, all these things always get entwined in politics, get entwined in how the stories are told. I think J.R.J., my grandfather, was not particularly good at handling the press and media and understanding the importance of that. He was loved by his men, but the fact of the matter is that you actually have to keep the morale of the nation in mind as well. So journalists weren't allowed, for example, in Scapa. They were allowed and very much welcomed in Rosyth with the battlecruiser fleet, and there are examples of journalists being embedded on the battlecruisers to tell the story. I think where things went very badly wrong was that when John Jelicoe left the command of the Grand Fleet at the end of 1916 and Sir David Beatty took over command. I mean, clearly Sir David Beatty stepped into a very tough role, but he very soon won the confidence of the fleet. What then happened, though, was not very tasteful, and that is that the official reporting and the official reporting that was to come out should not have been seen or interfered with by either admiral, Jelicoe or Beatty. Beatty got hold of it and wanted to have certain things changed. It's a natural inclination, but it's a very dangerous inclination when one is trying to preserve for posterity the truth and the facts of what actually happened on the day. It has to be a learning moment. And for many years, Jutland was embroiled in controversy where it was more a slugging match between the charismatic appeal of two men. My grandfather, very cerebral, rather small, not great looking. Sir David Beatty, very courageous, very attractive, maybe far too, what's the word?
Charismatic?
No, far too impatient to run after the enemy. He's certainly charismatic, but by no means do I disagree with that. But what this did was it actually took the focus away from the deeper questions about what the role of the Navy was, how victories are defined, that they're not necessarily, the metrics of defining a victory aren't necessarily quantitative. They actually should be intimately tied back to what the objectives of each party coming to the field of battle are, and whether those objectives are met. And I think it's only in the stretching of time that one can actually see the greater consequences of a battle or a campaign. And indeed, Jutland went from, and my grandfather himself even complained, he didn't quite know, one moment he was perceived as a victor, the next moment as the loser of the battle. But what is clear is that there were far, far wider strategic implications, one being the fact that the Germans decided that a one-on-one engagement with the Royal Navy was out of the question as a surface engagement, and that the better way was actually to reinstigate unrestricted submarine warfare and do so with an increased lethality and a real focus on trying to change the war and defeat Britain over 5 months. Well, they very nearly came close to doing that. In the last 2 weeks of April 1917, British and Allied shipping losses were just shy of 1 million tons, 860,000 tons. That's a huge amount when you consider that the overall carrying capacity was probably about 11.5 million tons. And if you're losing that much tonnage that fast, you're soon going to be out of the war, because you can't feed your armies and your populations are going to starve.
It's interesting.
Sorry, go ahead.
It's interesting how World War II kind of repeated itself, because after the Bismarck was sunk, they didn't want to have another surface engagement with the British either, and they relied upon the submarines, and they kept the Graf Spee in the sister ship of the Bismarck in Norway, essentially to protect it. So it's sort of the same thing they did in World War II. They avoided surface engagements and stuck to the submarines with initial...
I think that the Navy, whether it's the Hochseeflotte or the Kriegsmarine, were always the second-rate service, whereas for the British it was the senior service. We're an island nation. We depend on the sea, although we may have lost that vision a little bit today. Whereas Germany was a land power, and for Germany to try and develop a muscle at sea was out of character and very difficult to execute. And certainly Hitler only gave credence to the idea of building the German Navy in 1939. And the success of the submarine forces, again, was repeated as a terrible mistake by the Germans, that they didn't start off with much increased submarine resources. When Dönitz reintroduced that vigor into the submarine war in the Atlantic, it was a terrifying prospect for the British.
And when your grandfather passed away in the 30s, the German forces saluted him, right? There was a ceremony in his honor.
Yes, I think because, my grandfather, he'd fought with the Germans in China in 1900, so had David Beatty. And I think one should never forget that, current allies can be former foes, but there were many very deep friendships between the officers of these two navies. And I think Sir David Beatty's reputation with the Germans suffered as a result of how the internment of the High Seas Fleet was handled in November 1918. The surface fleet wasn't surrendered. It was handed over for internment. It was only the submarine force that was surrendered because they were seen as being almost a criminal weapon of war. And when Sir David Beatty ordered that the German flag be hauled down at sunset and not raised again without his permission, it was taken as a very, very deep snub by most German officers, most German naval officers, and they never really forgave him for that. It's interesting when John Jelicoe died, the flags of three nations, the Royal Navy, French Navy, and the Kriegsmarine, were lowered to mark that moment. And somewhere close to, I think, 150 admirals attended his funeral service at Westminster. Whereas with David Beatty, they only sent the naval attaché in London. And it was very much because of that. It was a resentment that just didn't go away.
All right, well, I just want to summarize because we're running out of time. But so the 1916 engagement was important. It was the largest battleship engagement up until that time. Is that right?
Well, it was the only dreadnought engagement that has ever happened.
The only dreadnought.
Because I think in the Second World War we head more towards carrier task forces. And never really have the kind of battle fleet engagement that we had at Jutland. Yep.
And basically, your grandfather preserved the fleet. The Germans never challenged the British again surface-wise. Once again, occurred off the coast of Denmark, the Jutland Peninsula. Could you please give your website again, Mr. Jelicoe?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I've got actually two websites now. The first one, the one to do on this is Jutland1916.com. And what's useful there is not only can one find the sort of the normal things that you would find on any website about this, but there's also an animation about the battle, which is a particularly good way to understand it visually. And plus, there's a very, very great depth of material for very serious research. So, for example, there's over 1,000 archive scans of my grandfather's obituaries and war diaries and things like that. So it's quite useful for anybody who wants to go on and research. And the other one that I've just launched is Scapa Flow 1919. So that's why I was talking about the interment of the German fleet, because we're coming in 2 weeks up to the centenary, the 21st of June 1919, of the scuttling of the German fleet at Scapa Flow.
Well, wonderful. Well, once again, we were speaking with Nick Jelicoe, the author of Jutland, The Unfinished Battle, whose grandfather was the admiral in charge of that battle, the Battle of Jutland, a very important battle. This is Intelligent Talk. The website is intelligenttalk.com. Mr. Jelicoe, thank you so much for your time today.
It's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting questions.
Thanks so much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye then.